Welcome back to another episode of Why Do I Do That? Today's question is, why do I keep going back to my ex? And I feel like this is going to be one that so many women can relate to. I know I can think of a lot of friends off the top of my head. I know that I've done this in the past. So yeah, there's three kind of key subjects that I want to focus on, or three key points I want to focus on today. And I was trying to think about this on the way here today. And I was thinking about there's only one ex-boyfriend that I did this with. And I was trying to think about why. Like, why was it him that I kept being drawn back to? And it's funny because he was the boyfriend that actually treated me probably the worst. And so I couldn't help but think about this, like, rejection breeds obsession. Like, it's one of my favorite things that I think it's Tony Robbins says, rejection breeds obsession. And so this like rejection and this feeling of rejection causes you to constantly have that chase after this person so that you can finally feel that feeling of acceptance. Because if we think about, human beings, and I talk about this in all episodes, if you think about, we are hardwired for love and acceptance and to be accepted into our communities. And so the feeling of rejection is like feels life-threatening. It feels foreign. It feels uncomfortable. It's awful. And so we become obsessed with wanting to like win this person over and wanting to get this person back because we just want them to love and accept us. And so that's where we kind of get caught in that cycle. And I guess with this ex-boyfriend of mine, I think I was in like my mid-20s and I had really low self-esteem, and he just kind of played on that by constantly telling me, oh, you shouldn't wear that and you don't look good in that, and your hair looks so much better when you were blonde. At the time I had black hair, believe it or not. And just, like constantly kind of bringing down my self-worth to the point where I felt like I needed him to validate me. And it was that acceptance piece that just kept coming up. So if I focus in on the 3 points, the first point is that a lot of people don't know how to be alone. They just have no idea how to do it. They feel uncomfortable. If you have this underlying subconscious belief that you are alone, which normally stems from childhood, then being alone is going to be painful. It's going to be uncomfortable. It's going to be almost excruciating because it's going to remind you of these wounds that you have. If you didn't grow up with those wounds, being alone isn't going to be an issue. So what can happen is when you break up with this partner, you have this feeling of aloneness come back up. And especially at nighttime, you'll often find that women who are breaking up with partners are messaging their exes at night because this feeling of loneliness sets in at nighttime. And they're messaging them because they're just unable to sit with that feeling of loneliness and with being alone. So my first advice to this person would be to get comfortable with being alone and with that feeling of loneliness, but also getting a little bit curious about where that comes from. Like, why can't you be alone? What's the wound there? Where did you feel alone when you were a child? Or was it in school? Were you left out? Were you sitting alone at lunchtime? Can relate. And start to heal those wounds so that you can actually become comfortable being alone, because one of the worst things that happens is if you can't feel comfortable being alone, you're going to probably end up in the wrong relationship. Not even just like going back to your ex, but ending up in the wrong relationship in the first place. I know so many people who are so scared of being alone that as soon as they leave a relationship, they get straight back into another relationship with the first person that they go on a date with or the first person that they meet, because they're just incapable of being alone. And so it means that that is an anxious attachment style. That anxious attachment is triggered when they feel that feeling of aloneness, and then they just go for the first person that comes along. And so, or the first person that seems okay. And so what happens is they end up with this person that is probably not right for them. Then they end up breaking up, and then they end up alone again. And it's this big cycle. So I would be looking at where that anxious attachment comes from and where these original wounds are, where you felt like you were alone. And that's something that you can do either with a therapist, or that's something that you can start doing yourself just through journaling. Like, when was the first time that I remember feeling this deep feeling of aloneness, or feeling like there was no one there for me? So alone, number one. Number two is comfort. It's just familiarity. So a lot of the time, our brain is always going to choose an uncomfortable familiar over an uncomfortable unfamiliar. Our brain is always going to choose what we know over taking a risk, over something unfamiliar. So we're always going to go back to something that we know how it goes, even if we know that it's awful, because we just know how it goes. And there's a level of safety in knowing how something's going to pan out. And we do that with all situations. There's a lot of people who there's people who like to watch the same movies because they know what's going to happen. Like, that is a type of person who is afraid of change, and who is afraid of kind of not knowing the answers, and who needs to be in control. This sort of person is going to go back to what's familiar because it feels comfortable. So that's like the second point, is just like, we go back to what we know, even if it isn't healthy or good for us. And I can again relate to this, not so much in leaving a relationship, but in being in a relationship, knowing that it feels wrong, but at the same time it feeling familiar. So I've been in a relationship, a long-term relationship, where the feeling was that this relationship wasn't right for me, but I was so used to being treated in this way from childhood that it also felt really familiar. So it was uncomfortable, but it was familiar. And the idea of actually leaving that relationship and, potentially experiencing something different, potentially not finding somebody at all of the different options and possibilities was so overwhelming, because I just didn't know what that would be or how that would look. So I would just stay where I was. So there is probably a number of people who, instead of continuing to break up and go back to their ex, don't actually leave in the first place when they want to and when they know that they should. So the other part to this is that we keep going back to the ex as well, because we think that they're going to change. Sometimes it's delusional. Sometimes it's us thinking, this time it will be different because X, Y, Z. And we have this little delusional part that takes over. And again, the delusional part takes over because it's trying to protect us. It comes up because it's like, well, they could change, and a lot's happened, and he did say this and that and da 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 da. And so we rationalize it out, and we bring this delusional part in so that we can go back to what's familiar, so that we can feel comfortable, safe, X, Y, Z. And so if you're having to sort of, bring this delusional part up and start having to rationalize why it could work and why you might be able to go back and et cetera, you are doing that because this person, as I said, feels familiar. But if you go a layer deeper, why do they feel familiar? So it's like, yes, they feel familiar because you've been with them in a relationship for a period of time, but who was it before them? Like, are they familiar because you were in a relationship with somebody in your earlier years who was similar? Or are they familiar because they treat you in the same way that a parent treated you? So a lot of the time, and again, I've spoken about this in a couple of previous episodes, a lot of the time we do this thing called repetition compulsion, where we actually are attracted to somebody who is similar or has similar traits or similar attachment styles or patterns as a parent who we didn't quite feel that we got the love that we needed from. And what happens is we attract this new partner, or we are attracted to this specific person because, one, it feels familiar, and two, we're trying to heal the original wound through somebody who feels familiar. If you have a parent that didn't love you, you're not going to choose somebody who is completely opposite to try and heal that wound. It's just not how it works. You're going to choose somebody who's sort of familiar so that it can feel like you're healing that original wound. So the problem with this is that when you choose this person, they're similar, which means that probably they're going to treat you a similar way and they're going to actually add to the issue. But then what happens is, if you get to the point where you've done enough work and you realize, okay, this person isn't right for me, I'm going to leave, what's triggered is all of those parts of yourself that haven't been loved, or those needs that haven't been met. But the problem is that if you choose somebody who is similar to the person who originally wounded you, which is what we do, we seek it out in an unconscious attempt to heal that wound, what happens is that person is inevitably going to hurt you. They're going to eventually not be able to meet the needs that the parent met. In very rare cases they can, but most of the time they can't. And what happens is when you break up with this person, when you realize that it feels shit to be with them because it's poking on all of these little old wounds that you have, when you leave them or when you break up with them, all of those parts start to come back in, those delusional parts that say they could have changed and it might be different this time. And what if we try this? And we could go to couples counseling or whatever it is. All of those like bargaining parts come back because they want you to get back with this person because you so desperately want to heal that wound or trauma, whatever you want to call it. I call them wounds because they feel like wounds. And so what is happening is we're going into this toxic cycle where we think that they're going to change and we bargain with ourselves and we get back together with them and then they don't change and we go back into the same cycle again. And I couldn't tell you how many clients I have that do this cycle, and I watch them and they say, oh, but he says this and he says that. And this is something that every woman, I believe, can either relate to or will have a friend that has had this happen to them. What's actually also part of the problem is that this person, most of the time it's a man. I do work with some same-sex couples, but majority of the time it is a woman talking about a man. What's happening is something in them is being triggered with the breakup as well. So you have to think about this from the other side. So this other person, when this breakup is happening, their wounds are being triggered too. And so we often see this like behavior from men where they will promise everything that they never gave. And they will promise to be different. They'll promise to change. They'll promise to stop partying, stop cheating, stop whatever it is. And they'll promise that they'll do better, that they'll do anything to get this woman back, because what's also happened is their attachment wounds have been triggered by the breakup. And we see it as manipulative behavior, but what's actually happened is the reason that they were treating you that way in the first place is because they also have wounds. And the reason that they're telling you that they're going to change is probably because at some level they do want to change and they do want you back and they do love you. So we have to start thinking about, instead of, seeing ourselves as the victim and seeing ourselves as this person who's having all of these things happen to them, we have to look at the situation and be like, okay, so why was I attracted to them? And if they are a person who is wounding me and they're continuing to add to those relational wounds, are they somebody who also has wounds? Because if a parent was treating you in that way, chances are they were also traumatized or had some sort of trauma that's carrying across. So we have to start thinking about the wounds of our partner. And this is where, if you are somebody who keeps going back to your ex, there is a recipe that needs to happen before this relationship can actually work. And that is, you need two people who can be alone if they need to. You need two people who are comfortable in themselves to be able to sit with that feeling of aloneness and to work out where that comes from, so that you are not magnetized and drawn back to each other out of a need to be wanted and out of a need and for this other person to want you and validate you and to just be there and to not be alone. You need to do that work individually before you're able to actually come back together to then start the process of healing your relational wounds together. And there can't be in this situation, if you are breaking up and getting back together, there needs to be a clean slate. I say to all of my couples that I work with, there needs to be a clean slate here, because if you're drawing on the past all the time, it's almost impossible for you to repair. There needs to be this clean slate where it's like, I'm responsible for me, you're responsible for you, but here's my wounds, and the other person saying, here's my wounds, and together we're going to help each other to heal them. There needs to be this like partnership, this coming together, instead of this idea, if you're constantly going back to them and your perception is, oh, what's wrong with me? I keep going back to my ex. I can't break it. I actually had a therapist say to me, I was in a long-term relationship. After years of working with me, she said to me, I've noticed something that you say in almost every session. The way that you speak about him is like he is a drug. And I was so blown away. I thought, no, I don't. What do you mean? And she'd actually written down words and she reflected them back to me. I can't remember what they are, but when she reflected them back to me, I was like, wow, okay. I actually am talking about this like he is a drug. Like, I hate him, but I need him, and I hate him and I don't want to be with him, but I'm drawn to him. It's like I can't get away from it. And it really did sound and feel like an addiction. And what that is, if you're like, ooh, can relate, like I keep going back to my ex because I am literally drawn to them. Like I cannot, imagine my life without them. And I am just sucked back in so easily and so quickly and so powerfully. That, my friends, is 100% a trauma bond, because safe love doesn't feel like that. It doesn't feel that chaotic and intense and addictive. That is not what safe love feels like. It feels calm and steady and regulated, and you can make clear, good, calm decisions around it. This type of love I'm talking about is toxic love, and it is known in the industry very well as a trauma bond. And this is two people who have trauma who bond together in an intensely passionate but toxic way. And again, for me, in this past relationship, I can again totally relate to the intense but toxic relationship I had with my father. And it felt, once I realized that addiction and once I realized this pattern, I could see the similarities in this person to my dad. I could see the similarities in the behaviors, in the way I was being loved, in the way I was being drawn in. Like I could see all of these patterns, not in saying that he is like him in the way of being a criminal and being a pedophile and things like that, but in the way that he loved and in the way that he treated me and in the way that I felt with him. It was so, so similar and so, so familiar, to the point that I actually had this belief, like this deep core belief and this feeling that if I left this relationship, I would die. I'd be killed. He would come for me. And it's not true, but it was he was so similar, and it felt so similar to the connection that I had with my dad that it was bringing up that same response. And for context, if you haven't listened to my life story, you can listen to it in episode 1. But the day that I actually cut my dad out of my life was one of the hardest days, probably the hardest day, to be honest, of my entire life, which sounds crazy considering all the trauma I've been through. But that day, I was 100% convinced, because he had told me throughout my entire childhood that, if you tell anyone, I will kill you. If you speak about this, I will kill you. Over and over and over, I will kill you. He held a pillow over my face and told me and suffocated me at night, telling me, I'll kill you if you ever say anything. I was traumatized into not speaking up. And here I am talking on a podcast. I was traumatized. And so the day that it wasn't ever never going to be a phone call, but the day that I actually spoke up and said to him, I can't have you in my life anymore. It was a text message, something along these lines. Because of everything you've done to me, I no longer want a relationship with you. I don't want to see you ever again. Please don't contact me. And he immediately tried to call me a number of times, and he tried to call my brother and my sister who were in the room with me. And I had the worst panic attack of my entire life. It's one of those days that used to play over in my mind, because my kids, they were very little, but they were in the room, and I just was so convinced in that moment when he tried to call and he had a message saying, I know where you are. I'm going to come. I need to come and talk to you. I was so convinced that he was coming to kill me that I just went into this absolute panic and was like, I just don't want to live. I don't want to live. I just want to die. I don't want to live. I can't deal with this. And I couldn't breathe. It was the worst panic attack. And so that memory and that day and that feeling of ending that relationship and of like severing those ties was in my psyche. It was in my DNA. It was in my body that like, if I was to leave this relationship that felt so similar to this other relationship, that the same thing would happen. And it was only through going through this act and removing this actual belief that I would die if that happened, that 2 weeks later I left that relationship. So it's crazy how intertwined these initial relationships with parental figures and things like that. And this doesn't have to be with a parent. My case is obviously quite extreme, but if you were in like a really toxic relationship when you were 14, that where you were told certain things and you were treated in a certain way, and you learned from that first relationship how to be treated, and that maybe they wouldn't let you break up with them, or whatever the toxic behaviors were, that can then affect later relationships where you continue to go back or you feel like you can't leave, because this initial first relationship has kind of programmed how you believe relationships are going to be. So the trauma bond, back to the trauma bond feels intense. It feels chaotic. It feels passionate. It feels like you're being drawn to them. And that is like your first indication and sign that it is toxic and that it's actually not a healthy, healing relationship for you. So if you want to learn more about trauma bonds and you want to learn more about attachment styles and these original wounds and how they affect you and how to not go back to the ex and all of that, I have a program that is popping off called Love Wounds. I recorded it probably 6 months ago, and it's quickly becoming one of my most purchased workshops. It's a 2-hour workshop and we go through all of this. Highly recommend. So if you know somebody who keeps going back to an ex and you think they need to know about, being able to be alone and breaking that unfamiliar, uncomfortable cycle and, this toxic relationship cycle, definitely send them this episode.